She was an astonishingly prolific author of many novels, many biographies, many short stories. She was a big bestseller in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and she was famous in her own right.
For people who only know the Hitchcock films, knowing who Daphne du Maurier is gives a really interesting view into some of Hitchcock's works.
Daphne du Maurier is a very versatile author.
Two of Alfred Hitchcock's most iconic films are The Birds and Rebecca, both based on works by Daphne du Maurier. Hitchcock also did an adaptation of her book Jamaica Inn. So there was no other author that Hitchcock leaned on and relied on more than Daphne du Maurier.
She specialized in Gothic and adventure thrillers. Also supernatural, mainly stories, but also sort of supernatural tales. And I think she was just interested generally in the kind of dark side of human nature.
She was born in London in 1907. She was the second of 3 daughters.
She is the descendant of a family that was, innately theatrical, dealt with sensation as if it were the stuff of everyday life.
She started writing when she was very young, when she was in her 20s. And she has all sorts of family connections to help her get published. So she was always writing, but she never wrote anything major or anything famous until Rebecca.
Her grandfather was George du Maurier, who wrote caricatures for a very popular magazine called Punch, but he's probably best known today, if he's remembered at all, for a novel called Trilby. Trilby is the story of a young woman who is taught and actually kind of controlled by a very magnetic impresario whose name is Svengali. Svengali is this kind of magnetic but also sort of menacing male figure who both attracts you and repels you.
In Rebecca, I think Mrs. Danvers is Svengali. She's always telling the wife how to think and how to feel and what to do.
You've nothing to stay for. You've nothing to live for, really, have you? Look down there. It's easy, isn't it? Why don't you? Why don't you?
She implants her obsessions in the nameless wife, as Svengali does Trilby.
This sort of legacy of a kind of new masculinity, if you will, that is tied with the arts, is then passed on, I think, to her father, who is Gerald du Maurier, who was an actor and an impresario himself.
He was in a couple of movies. He was in an early Hitchcock movie, which he absolutely hated doing. He thought you had to repeat yourself over and over again, and that was very boring for him.
In the 1890s, Gerald du Maurier was, of course, a major leading man on the London stage.
Daphne du Maurier's father was J.M. Barrie's leading actor in many of his productions.
James Barrie was a prodigiously gifted writer because he knew how to write a very beautiful, well-crafted story.
James Barrie is certainly best known as the author of Peter Pan and several books and things based on the play.
She knew J.M. Barrie exceedingly well. In fact, she used to play with the boys that inspired J.M. Barrie to write Peter Pan.
And it was Gerald who was the original Captain Hook, who made Captain Hook a double part with Mr. Darling. That's not in J.M. Barrie's first script.
He also wrote a play called Mary Rose, which Hitchcock saw in the 1920s and was deeply influenced by.
It stayed with him his entire life. It's about a very beautiful, young, childlike woman who has an experience on an island where the island almost devours and calls her. In the course of the play, she comes back, but everyone around her has grown old. She has not. The creepiness as well as the romanticism of the play is that she can't fit in. She doesn't know who she is. He very, very much wanted to make a film of Mary Rose and brought it up with various actresses over the years. I think it's the kind of film that would have been a companion piece to Vertigo in its sense of the otherworldly and the sense of worlds within worlds that Hitchcock so loved.
Rebecca is an ideal story for Hitchcock to direct because Hitchcock often did his movies in having an ordinary man rising to the challenge and becoming something more than he was. And in this case, we have our unnamed narrator.
Last night, I dreamt I went to Manderley again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive.
She is not ready to handle this, and yet she's thrown into a situation and she must rise to the challenge. So in that case, this is ideal for a Hitchcock story.
It's kind of logical also that Selznick would connect up Rebecca with Alfred Hitchcock. After all, it does involve a kind of mysterious figures, a question of the guilt of the main character. Is the husband of Rebecca really a murderer, or is he innocent of this? It has a big house with mysterious goings-on in it. A lot of it seems to come out of some of the 20s and 30s Hitchcock films from Britain.
Daphne du Maurier and Alfred Hitchcock are a very sort of interesting odd couple. They come from very different traditions, although in some ways you could argue that they're both intrinsically British. I think in their best moments, they modernized the Gothic by naturalizing it, that is, by making it a sort of feature of everyday modern life.
Hitchcock and du Maurier both looked at issues of characters being in a world where they felt alien. And they did this from very different perspectives. Daphne du Maurier grew up part of a privileged family.
She knows the world from the inside. She's lived it, she's experienced it, she knows it. Alfred Hitchcock comes from a very working class, modest, greengrocer background.
Hitchcock always felt like a pretender in the world of class and privilege. And so they looked at these issues separately. They looked at these issues from very different ways.
Hitchcock is a filmmaker who makes moral darkness incredibly attractive without making it necessarily lurid.
Without question, Hitchcock's sensibility is Gothic. It's dark. When you look at this run of pictures that Hitchcock made with Selznick, they tend to have this Gothic dimension.
Hitchcock is fascinated by some of the same sorts of things. The dark side of human nature, crime, and a bit of horror.
Rebecca is obviously a Gothic story, but what is a Gothic?
Gothic is a term used to define a certain literary and cinematic genre that is the Cinderella fairy tale gone deeply, deeply wrong.
In the Gothic I know and love, ordinary life is made very creepy. Everything that's supposed to be comforting becomes frightening and out to get you.
It's a genre that really sort of comes into the fore with Jane Eyre, which defines a lot of elements which are repeated over and over again.
A Gothic has several important elements. One is usually a young woman from a lower class who falls in love with the so-called Prince Charming of an estate or a big house.
She falls in love and gets married to, in essence, the prince of the castle.
Manderley, I think, is what makes the novel sing. In the movie, Manderley is certainly the center point, and it's where everything happens, and it's where the heart of the story is. But in the book, it's more fully fleshed out, and you see the path that takes forever. The house itself is a character in the sense that everything that happens is because of its influence. And as characters influence one another and interact with one another, Manderley is a real presence there.
One way or another, this house that's usually introduced rather innocently becomes a character unto itself and an exceedingly dark character as the story progresses.
She moves in and she's taken into that world. And what she thinks is paradise and what we, the audience, think is paradise is anything but.
What she finds when she gets in there is that there is a moral turpitude that has set in, a rot that has set in. There is some level of corruption. There is some secret that is hidden away.
Whether it's the woman in the tower in Jane Eyre or the ghost of Rebecca in Rebecca.
And in the confrontation of this, there is a confrontation of sort of an incestuous madness that takes over in a certain way, and invariably, the great house is destroyed.
Which, in the end, comes to define moral corruption, decay, a real darkness that is not present on the exterior.
Perhaps the most Gothic element of Rebecca is the housekeeper.
You wouldn't think she'd been gone so long, would you? Sometimes when I walk along the corridor, I fancy I hear her just behind me. That quick, light step. I couldn't mistake it anywhere. It's not only in this room. It's in all the rooms in the house. I can almost hear it now.
In both the book and the movie, it is one of the creepiest scenes you'll ever experience because Mrs. Danvers feels Rebecca alive again.
Do you think the dead come back and watch the living?
I don't believe it.
Sometimes. I wonder if she doesn't come back here to Manderley.
And she opens the drawer with her underthings. Here, these are the underthings that Rebecca wore. And touch this, put it against your cheek. Do you feel it? Do you smell her? And look, this is just laid out, just the way, as if she had just left it there. And she takes our poor heroine and creeps her out and makes the heroine realize for the first time how much of a life force Rebecca is for Mrs. Danvers. She is Mrs. Danvers' reason for being.
Daphne du Maurier was interested in love in its more demonic and beguiling varieties.
When she wrote Rebecca and the others, it wasn't really taboo to write about lesbianism.
Daphne du Maurier's sexuality was adventurous, exploratory, bisexual. She fell in love with men and with women. And so that this split sense of herself as partly female, partly male, I think accounts for, some of the splitting, some of the bisexuality, some of the lesbianism, perhaps, that you see in her novels. All of her relationships seem to have been marked by this need and this capacity for erotic enthrallment.
Daphne du Maurier married Frederick Boy Browning, and they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Browning was one of the characters in A Bridge Too Far.
It'll be the largest airborne operation ever mounted.
And he was not portrayed very well, but she rose to her husband's defense, and she complained quite loudly that his portrayal was not done to her satisfaction.
I'm so sorry.
I think she's really, to this day, one of the least understood and most undervalued writers to explore sadomasochism as a necessary element and erotic subjection as a kind of exciting element in particularly erotically fatal attractions. One of the most important scenes, both in the novel and in the film, the broken Cupid. There is Cupid, the god of love, whose arrows, in fact, infect us fatally. Something has been broken in the sexual contact between men and women, or women and women, that perhaps can never be repaired. And it seems as if Rebecca is a kind of meditation about that. All you have are these shattered pieces. Cupid is broken, and what do? You don't try to put it back together again. You try to shove the pieces in the back drawer, hoping that it will go away. But of course it doesn't go away, it comes back to haunt you.
She hated the fact that she was attracted to women because this put her relationship with her father at odds. And I think when you look at the dynamic between Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca, you see Daphne's relationship with herself.
Why don't you go? Why don't you leave Manderley? He doesn't need you. He's got his memories. He doesn't love you. He wants to be alone again with her.
Daphne du Maurier had her own Manderley. It was a place called Menabilly, which was on the Cornish coast, where she retreated for most of her life.
In 1943, after she wrote Rebecca, she did lease Menabilly, and she moved the family into it.
It was a very physically kind of uncomfortable place in many ways, but she loved it because of its roughness, because of the irregularities, because she could be herself there.
I would think that du Maurier liked being within herself more than anything at all.
So it's sort of fascinating in a way that Menabili would be projected as Manderley, because there's a kind of aggression against her own instincts to settle, to find a place where she can nest.
So the dream house of Manderley is really the dream house of Menabili. And in the first chapter of Rebecca, Manderley is this dream overgrown, smothered dream memory for the speaker, as Menabili was a dream memory for Daphne du Maurier.
One way to read the relationship between Menabili and Manderley is that Manderley is a way for her to exercise from her own imagination some of the guilt associated with her own retreat into this insular life, the retreat from the sociable existence that in fact her father and her sisters seemed to crave.
When Daphne du Maurier was about 60 and her children were grown and her husband was ailing and then dead, she had to move and she was very unhappy and very upset. There's this terrible line which is taken out of the movie, terrible in that it's so terrifying: there will be no resurrection. And there was no resurrection.
Now, the interesting thing about the Gothic genre is, why does it exist? What is it? What is the intrigue of it? The Gothic becomes hugely popular at times when the social contract is being re-examined.
When Rebecca came out, it was a bestseller. Women all over were just excited to pick up the story that they could relate to, of this ordinary, sort of bland young girl who rose to become something more than she had been at the beginning of the book, and they could relate to her.
It is a way of retelling the Cinderella myth and also destroying the notion of class and station and privilege in this world.
Mrs. De Winter. Goodbye, my dear, and good luck.
If you look at the structure of Rebecca, it's a film which really is operatic in structure.
David O. Selznick really believed that the book Rebecca should be their Bible and that they should follow it as closely as possible. And there are amazingly accurate sections of dialogue that seem just lifted from the book. Hitchcock was great with suspense, and Selznick, coming off of Gone with the Wind and the romance of it, and the two of them working together brought forth this film that is a truly fabulous adaptation of the book. Du Maurier took the Gothic novel and she put herself into it, she put her heart into it. There's so much real emotion in the unnamed narrator.
The self-projection of Daphne du Maurier is Rebecca.
You definitely should read Daphne du Maurier today. She's an absolutely astute, subtle psychologist with such a sense of what will entertain and amuse as well as enthrall us that you really can't do much better in the realm of popular fiction.